As of today, December 15th, 2024, nearly all of the Gaza Strip's 2.23 million residents face acute food insecurity. This is a direct consequence of actions by Israel, which, according to the International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan, include extermination, causing great suffering, serious injury, and starvation of civilians as a method of warfare in the ongoing armed conflict. The ICC has also issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Billaud on the grounds of widespread and systematic attack against Gaza's civilian population. While Israel bears primary responsibility, increasing attention is being placed on the role of its private actors in the ongoing starvation.
Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Humanitarian Aid Under Fire, Tzav 9 and its legal implications. Today, we'll delve into the role of Tzav 9, a settler group accused of blocking humanitarian aid to Gaza. We'll examine their actions within the broader context of Israeli war crimes, discussing structural, legal, and humanitarian implications. Tzav 9 serves as a case study to explore the complex dynamics between private groups and the state, with a particular focus on assessing the extent of state accountability for enabling or failing to prevent such actions under international law. I'm Addison Heintz, and this podcast is produced in collaboration with my group members,
Alexander Hoang,
Linda Brunner,
and Stefania Plougarli.
We're students from the Geneva Graduate Institute, and this podcast is part of our course, Human Rights and Humanitarianism Through the Concepts.
Tzav 9 was founded on Facebook and WhatsApp in January of 2024 by Reut Benheim and Shlomo Sarid. Comprising of over 400 active members, it includes Israeli settlers, members of the IDF, and family members of victims from Hamas's October 7th attack. Between January and May of 2024, the group staged several ambushes, looting and burning aid trucks attempting to enter Gaza. Their stated rationale was to prevent resources from falling into Hamas's hands. Despite international condemnation, including sanctions on Tzav 9 from the US and EU, Israeli authorities refrained from intervening, with National Security Minister Ben-Gvir instructing police not to protect the aid convoys.
To explore these issues further, we're honored to welcome Tom Dannenbaum, Associate Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. Professor Dannenbaum is a leading expert on international humanitarian law, specializing in starvation as a war crime and siege warfare.
Welcome, Professor. We're so happy to have you here today. To start, given your expertise in international humanitarian law, can Tzav 9 as a private entity be seen as directly contributing to the war crime of starvation?
All persons are bound by the components of international humanitarian law that can entail individual criminal responsibility, and one of those is starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. So the two key substantive elements are first that the perpetrator deprived civilians of objects indispensable to their survival, which is the legal term of art for objects such as food, water, medical provisions, and other objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. And the second component is that the perpetrator intended to starve civilians as a method of warfare. In this case, Tzav 9 has clearly engaged in acts of deprivation targeted at objects indispensable to civilian survival. There's really no contesting that. The remaining question is, did they engage in this action with the requisite intention, namely the intention to starve civilians as a method of warfare? And the precise threshold for this is perhaps more disputed, but reporting indicates that Tzav 9 has engaged in fundraising that specifically asserts that humanitarian aid for Gazan civilians must be withheld. So in my view, therefore, it is straightforwardly intentional starvation of civilians. Now, the one question that remains is the question of belligerent nexus.
The belligerent nexus, referenced by Professor Dannenbaum, is the requirement that an action must occur within and be part of an armed conflict to fall under the provisions of international humanitarian law.
And I think it's very clear that the armed conflict has played a critical role in Tzav 9's decision and purpose to impede humanitarian relief into Gaza. And so in that context, I think it's fairly clear that they could meet the belligerent nexus requirement. For all of those reasons, I think Tzav 9 and its conduct clearly implicates the war crime of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. And all of that is true, in my view, even though Tzav 9's role is, relatively speaking, minor compared to that of the Israeli government.
I see.
Now that we have established that Tzav 9 is indeed contributing to the war crime of starvation, the kind of logical next question would be, does the State of Israel bear any responsibility for the group's actions of blocking humanitarian aid? And more specifically, maybe, does Israel's status as an occupying power, as it has been dictated by the ICJ advisory opinion on July 19 of 2024, have anything to do with it?
So the fact that Tzav 9 is a private entity or a group that is not itself attributable to the state does not mean Israeli state responsibility is not implicated. It has clear obligations affirmatively to ensure the delivery of humanitarian access and the food and medical supply generally to Gaza, and that includes by making sure that it's exercising due diligence to prevent actors like Tzav 9 from impeding that humanitarian relief and to protect the humanitarian actors and humanitarian relief operations from impediment or harassment by such groups. In fact, even if Israel weren't the occupying power in Gaza, Israel would still have obligations under Common Article 1 and its parallel customary international law manifestation to ensure respect for international humanitarian law more generally.
Customary law associated with Common Article 1 of the Geneva Convention requires states to ensure that persons in their territory or under their jurisdiction are adherent to international law. In this context, this includes Tzav 9.
The final thing actually to note is that once Israel has accepted aid deliveries, accepted humanitarian access, which in the case of Tzav 9's conduct, it has, we're talking about the impediment of trucks that are coming from Jordan to Gaza on the basis of Israel's consent, it has a duty to protect those humanitarian actors and to facilitate the rapid and unimpeded delivery of that aid.
Yes, absolutely. That is a very relevant and important point to remember because in reality, we have seen that Israel has been rather unwilling to uphold these obligations that you just mentioned. They have in fact done very little to counter Tzav 9. For example, although they did arrest several members in May, no indictments have actually been filed. And of course, this makes us question whether this inaction might be connected to Tzav 9's goals actually aligning with those of Israel.
Their actions are articulated explicitly in terms of one of Israel's explicit war aims. It seems quite clear that it sees itself as performing a function that is facilitating the armed conflict.
Exactly. In looking at all of this, it actually gives us insight into the very problematic relationship Israel has with its violent groups. This lack of accountability for Tzav 9 really shows us how systematic Israel upholds patterns of impunity and violence. And we have seen that historically, Israel has failed to adequately prosecute individuals or groups whose actions align with state objectives. Take, for example, Israeli settlers whose settlements have been declared illegal. This has led to groups like Tzav 9 actually feeling emboldened to act with very little fear of prosecution, even when their actions violate international law.
So this then leads us to the question of how we can hold both Israel and Tzav 9 accountable for their actions. So if we consider that Tzav 9 plays a smaller role in the overall starvation of Gaza, do you think it is meaningful to pursue accountability under international criminal law?
This particular component is not the most significant component, but it is clearly a meaningful component and therefore is one that certainly warrants attention, including attention with respect to accountability. Primary accountability mechanisms, of course, criminal accountability along the lines that I've just been discussing. So there's sanctions and then criminal accountability. And in addition to both of those, states generally have an obligation to repress and suppress breaches of international humanitarian law through other means. So when it comes to grave breaches or serious violations, in other words, war crimes, they have an obligation specifically to pursue criminal accountability for those violations. That particular war crime hasn't been prosecuted at the international level, so there's something of a dearth of precedent.
So we understand that the chances are quite low that Tzav 9 will be held accountable by international courts or Israel itself. But there are alternative methods for accountability. In particular, we're thinking about the sanctions on Tzav 9 by the United States in June 2024 for obstructing and destroying humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza. Now, how effective do you think were these sanctions in influencing Tzav 9's further actions?
There's at least some evidence that Tzav 9 started to move away from impeding humanitarian relief after the sanctions were put in place. It appears that they might be now reversing that stance more recently, but at least initially, they had been engaged in repeated impediments of humanitarian relief, and they shifted their tactics subsequent to these sanctions. But the question that I would want to see evaluated is whether that impact is actually outweighed by the impact of making it appear to some audience that the US and other actors were active in responding to the starvation of Gaza, or by the impact of making it appear that the primary problem was the problem of private violators such as Tzav 9 rather than Israeli state conduct. Where the US has been much less effective is in actually imposing significant consequences for the Israeli government when it has failed to meet its obligations regarding humanitarian access. I think, therefore, one has to be very careful about seeing any significant success associated with the change of Tzav 9's conduct subsequent to the sanctions on that particular group. That doesn't mean that the sanctions against such groups are unwarranted. It more means that we should not be overly sanguine about these kinds of efforts when they occur against the backdrop of a failure to address state responsibility.
So, as you just mentioned, there is a lot to consider when it comes to the role of sanctions as a form of accountability. In light of this, we wonder if achieving proper accountability for those groups is possible, considering the context of historical failures that have allowed such groups to operate with impunity.
Precisely. In fact, we are seeing a global rise in transnational violence being carried out by private actors, just like in the case of Tzav 9. And therefore, we might have to consider, is the privatization of violence, as this phenomenon is called, a kind of legal loophole to avoid state responsibility?
Well, certainly it's long been the case that states have used proxy forces or non-state partners. So clearly the involvement of actors that are not state officials in context of conflict complicates the question of attribution of responsibility to states. And sometimes that's a deliberate effort by the state to avoid legal responsibility by essentially outsourcing conduct to private actors. In some cases, it might be that the private actors are acting on their own initiative, and it's not really about the state specifically outsourcing, but it might be benefiting from the fact that this conduct is aligned with its interests, and yet it's not directly attributable with that conduct. But either way, it does mean that it's harder to attribute the conduct in question to the state.
Yes, this is certainly very important to keep in mind, because we have seen how Israel leverages this ambiguity around state responsibility to pursue goals that align with illegal actions. And what has also become clear is, by failing to counter these actions, Israel effectively supports them. In turn, this creates a practically lawless environment, where violence thrives without proper attribution to the state. But the most dangerous thing about it is that it conceals Israel's active role in the context of systemic violence.
Such dynamics Israel has occasionally denounced groups like Tzav and perpetuates its broader inaction underscores tacit support. This reflects not just a failure of Israel's judicial system, but a broader lack of political will from the international community to enforce existing legal frameworks. Sanctions against Tzav 9 may have had some impact in deterring future abuses by signaling clear consequences, but focusing solely on private actors risks obscuring the state complicity that allows such actions to continue.
In this podcast, we've explored legal avenues for responsibility and accountability, showing that international law offers hope for a brighter and just future. Law is a powerful tool, but its effectiveness depends on how we use it. When peace is finally achieved in Palestine, it must be accompanied by accountability for the war crimes committed by all parties involved. Progress may be slow, but every step towards accountability brings us closer to a world where justice is the norm, not the exception.